And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society.
We have to acknowledge that there is something wrong when we are locking up this many folks with this kind of frequency.
Instead of trying to fight what the system is, let's try to find a way to do something that might work compared to the last 200 years of America. Locking them up and throwing away the key doesn't fix anything.
By this point, we've all heard the infamous statistic. The United States houses almost a quarter of the world's prison population. But how much of mass incarceration is a result on the war on drugs? Or simply just because of stricter sentencing policies? What do prisons look like right here in Germany? And how do their programs differ, not just from a punishment standpoint, but in their ability to rehabilitate inmates and reduce the instance of former offenders, including teens and young adults, from re-entering the prison system in the future? These essential questions are actually a lot harder to answer than you might expect. So, without further ado, let's dive in. So why does America imprison so many people? Well, that just might be one of the most loaded questions ever asked on this channel because there really isn't just one straight answer to it. In short, the rise of crime, with the exception of white-collar crime, goes part and parcel with many of the legacies left from policies that systematically disenfranchise minorities, while at the same time widening the gap between the haves and have-nots. Along with the rise of segregation by income and race in the suburbs, we see a greater concentration of violent crime in the aftermath of the declining communities, more wealthy families left behind, taking their tax dollars with them that goes toward funding for police, fire, roads, schools, and public infrastructure. And again, while I don't think it's really correct just to lay this entire problem at the feet of urban planning and planning policies, I do believe that this is actually a big part in why property crime and violent crime are significantly lower here in Germany. Communities here are not only more homogenous by income, but being in a low-income or high-income community doesn't mean you have major differences in the quality of public transit, public schools, or opportunities for work. But it makes a huge difference in the United States. So today in the United States, those areas where violence, drug crime, and gun violence run the most rampant are also the places where the root causes of poverty also run the most rampant. But here's something interesting. In the first episode of our series, I discussed crime and how property crime and violent crime have actually dropped dramatically in both the US and Germany over the past 30 years. So how can it be then that we're imprisoning more people in the US if less crime is being committed? Well, there's two reasons really. And the first is that we've actually experienced an explosion in drug-related offenses. In 1980, imprisonment for drug offenses was rare, with a combined state incarceration rate of 15 per 100,000 population. But by 2010, the drug incarceration rate had increased nearly tenfold to 143 per 100,000 people. And the growth in imprisonment, most rapid in the 1980s and then slower in the 90s and 2000s, is attributable largely to increases in prison admission rates and time served. And those increased admission rates are closely associated with increased incarceration for drug crimes. And interestingly, drug offenses and addiction don't actually play as big of a role in the criminal justice system here in Germany. Instead, they rely on the harm reduction approach as their primary response to drug use. So rather than target minor possession or sales, law enforcement focuses instead on more significant crimes, such as drug trafficking. And so as a result, the number of people incarcerated in Germany for minor drug offenses is actually relatively really small. But the second reason for America's significantly larger incarceration rate actually goes back to the general law and order approach that Americans tend to take towards incarceration and sentencing. According to the most recent estimates, there are 2 million people in US prison and jails, a 500% increase over the last 40 years, and changes in sentencing law and policy not changes in crime rates, explain most of this increase. And according to researchers, there are actually two big phases that have affected this shift. Some positive, some negative, depending on who you ask. From the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, there was a wave of reforms aimed at making sentencing procedures fairer and outcomes more predictable and consistent. The problems to be solved were racial and other unwarranted disparities, and the mechanisms for solving it were various kinds of comprehensive sentencing and parole guidelines and statutory sentencing standards. But then in the second phase, from about the mid-1980s through 1996, we saw changes in sentencing policies that were aimed at primarily making sentences for drugs and violent crimes harsher, and their imprisonment more certain. Mandatory minimum sentence laws required minimum prison terms for people convicted of particular crimes. Three strikes laws typically required a minimum of a 25-year sentence for people convicted of a third felony. And state truth in sentencing laws typically required that people sentenced to imprisonment for affected crimes serve at least 85% of their nominal sentence. And all of these things together are why today, amid historically low crime rates, there are a record 206,268 people serving life or virtual life sentences in America's prisons. 1 out of every 7 people in prison. Now, admittedly, this next statistic is a little bit old. I couldn't find a more modern replication of this study, but it's striking nonetheless. In 2006 in Germany, 75% of prison sentences were for 12 months or less, and 92% of sentences were for 2 years or less. In addition, Germany suspended the vast majority of prison sentences that were under 2 years, about 75% of those cases. So only a very small percentage of those sentenced actually ever went to prison. But you know, the other big issue here too is that crime is heavily politicized in the United States. And whether you're Democrat or Republican, nobody really wants to be seen as being light on crime. Even though national survey data shows us that most victims support violence prevention, social investment, and alternatives to incarceration that address the root cause of the crime, policymakers, judges, and prosecutors often invoke the name of the victims to justify long sentences for violent offenses, because often these people have to run for re-election.
When we're talking about serious and violent crime, lock them up. In San Francisco, in my office, we've increased the conviction rates for the DA's office to the highest they've been in just under 15 years.
Not all US states elect their judges through elections, but it's worth noting that partisan elections are held to select most or all judges in 13 states, and for some judges in an additional 8 states. Meaning not only are they on the voting ballot like any other politician, but that in 13 states, they also have to list whether they're Republican or Democrat. But on the flip side of things, here in Germany, judges and prosecutors aren't elected. They're government employees who are insulated from public opinion. And their work is really seen as just being more technical. Their role is to protect the rational system of correction, which aims to restrict freedom the least amount necessary, and to do so from the retributive impulses that individual victims and society in general might feel. Okay, and you know, speaking of Germany, I think this is kind of enough of a background on Germany and the US. I think it's actually time we take a look inside a German prison and just see how different things look compared to the United States. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, in the United States, there are roughly 2 million people currently incarcerated. And I think what's actually super fascinating is that the conditions of their imprisonment in the United States are pretty miserable by most international standards. Most US prisons lack fresh air, healthy food, natural light, proper healthcare, and connection to loved ones. And for so many, punishment means not only the temporary loss of liberty, but brutal prison conditions. In a new report spearheaded by the Yale Law School, the number of prisoners subjected to restrictive housing, which is what solitary confinement is officially known by, stood between 41,000 and 48,000 in the summer of 2021. They were being held alone in cells the size of parking spaces for 22 hours a day on average and for at least 15 days. And within that number, more than 6,000 prisoners have been held in isolation for over a year. They include almost 1,000 people who have been held on their own in potentially damaging confined spaces for a decade or longer, in breach of minimum standards laid down by the UN, which considers such isolation a form of torture. And compare this to Germany, where solitary confinement is not only rare, it's only used in exceptional cases for a very short period of time. At Waldeck prison, for example, solitary confinement reportedly was only used 2 or 3 times in the past year, while Neustrelitz prison had utilized its segregation cell twice in 5 years, and only for a few hours each time. And by legal statute, this kind of disciplinary detention cannot exceed, in any given year, 4 weeks in Germany. But honestly, even outside of solitary confinement, the conditions of an American prison cell are extremely different from what you'll find here in Germany. On the extreme end of the spectrum, you have U.S. Penitentiary Administrative Maximum, also known as ADX Florence, which has been nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies and Supermax. It's a modern, super maximum security federal prison located in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains near Florence, Colorado. Opened in 1994, the ADX Supermax facility was designed to incarcerate and isolate criminals deemed as being too dangerous for even the average prison system. The majority of prisoners here are kept in administrative segregation. They're confined to a specifically designed single-person cell for 23 hours a day. And prisoners are only moved around under strict restraints, handcuffed, shackled, or both. And for their 1 hour a day that they get outside of that cell, they're only allowed to shower, exercise, and if they get the privilege, make a phone call. But to be honest, even the prison that's been nicknamed America's cushiest prison or Camp Cupcake, seriously, it actually really isn't all that nice. FCP Alderson, located in the foothills of West Virginia's Allegheny Mountains, has housed some pretty famous inmates, from Martha Stewart to an ex-beauty queen to a famous American jazz singer. Built in 1928, the prison was actually the first federal prison for women, and today it uses a reformatory model where women are housed in cottages and there's no barbed wire. But unlike their counterparts in the United States, German prisoners actually sleep on a bed with a real mattress, not just a thin foam pad on top of a concrete slab. At Heidering prison near Berlin, for example, not only do they stay in rooms that more closely resemble an IKEA showroom, but they have privacy. Correctional officers knock before entering, and prisoners get to wear their own clothes. They can decorate their space as they wish, and they cook their own meals, are paid more for their work, and have opportunities to visit family, learn skills, and gain education. In fact, inmates are actually required to save money to ensure that they're not penniless upon release. Now, to be fair, Heidering prison is one of the newest prisons in Germany and doesn't necessarily represent the standard of prison life across the country as a whole. So not too far away is another prison, the Tegel Correctional Center, opened in 1898 and is actually the oldest prison in Berlin. But things here are still much less institutional than American prisons. They do have institutional clothing, which is provided, but again, you're allowed to wear your own clothes if you want to. Each unit has a specific time and day, which relatives can actually drop off clothes for the inmates. Some even exchange their dirty laundry and get fresh clothing from their relatives each week. And at this prison in Berlin, there's a workshop where inmates build and repair bicycles. But I think what's most remarkable at Tegel Prison is that there are 33 physicians to care for 4,200 inmates. That's a ratio of about 1 doctor for every 120 prisoners. By contrast, in the Virginia state system, according to a recent count, there was 1 doctor for every 750 inmates. And to be honest, when we look at all of what this means collectively for life in prison between the US and Germany, it says a lot about how we regard prisoners as our society. Because at the end of the day, the American society very much kind of has this attitude of lock them up and throw away the key. And when that's your attitude, you don't really care so much about what the conditions are of a prison system because you're not really thinking about these people getting out and what their life's going to be like afterwards. But in Germany, consistent with the principle of normalization, offenders who serve time in prison are not stripped of their rights as members of society. For example, prisoners in Germany retain their right to vote and often receive certain social welfare benefits. They also don't suffer the collateral consequences of conviction that befalls so many offenders in the United States after release, such as restrictions on housing and professional licensing, limited access to social benefits, and suspended driver's licenses. They're also given opportunities to spend time outside of prison while they're still serving time. Because in Germany, recognizing that strong family and community connections are associated with successful reentry outcomes, corrections officials routinely award prisoners short-term and extended home leave visits to visit with family, to search for work or accommodation for after their release. Strikingly, the failure rate from home leave, which is the failure for that prisoner to actually return, amounts to a mere 1%. And many prisoners consider denial of leave as more severe of a sanction than detention in solitary confinement. One of my all-time favorite movies is The Shawshank Redemption. It's one of the greatest movies ever made, in my opinion, but to be honest, it also paints a picture of US prison life that isn't really largely the case today. Namely, that US prison workers are being exploited for private sector jobs. Because in reality, only about 5,000 people in prison, less than 1%, are employed by private companies through the federal PIECP program, which requires them to pay at least minimum wage before deductions. In fact, a larger portion of work occurs for state-owned correctional industries, where you're doing things like making license plates, which, by the way, it's actually estimated that 80% of the license plates in the US are produced in prisons. So that's something. But it should be noted that these jobs do pay much less than the private sector jobs. But again, honestly, like even in these correctional industries, it really only represents about 6% of the people incarcerated in state prisons. So what about the other 90+% of people who are actually required to have a job while in the prison system? Well, in the United States, prisons usually rely on the labor of incarcerated people for food service, laundry, and other daily operations. But they pay incarcerated workers unconscionably low wages. A 2017 study by the Prison Policy Initiative found that on average, incarcerated people earn between 86 cents and $3.45 per day for most common prison jobs. In at least 5 states, those jobs pay nothing at all. And again, work in prison is compulsory, and incarcerated workers have few rights and protections. And what's quite shocking is that those next to nothing wages they receive often go right back to the prison, which charges them for basic necessities like medical visits and hygiene items. Now, here in Germany, similar to the US, most prisoners do work. In fact, they're actually required to work in 12 of Germany's 16 states. But they have a much wider range of jobs and bigger differences in pay and benefits. So whether you're working in the prison kitchen, in a carpentry workshop, or screwing together components for locksmiths, The average prisoner in Germany earns between 1 to 3 euros an hour. Now don't get me wrong, this is still very much below minimum wage, but the average German prisoner earns more in 1 hour than the American prisoner earns for an entire day's worth of work. Plus, German prisoners get to keep their money, and the German prison system pays for things like unemployment insurance and covers their healthcare costs. But I do want to be fair. It's not always 100% rosy in Germany. The money prisoners do earn is usually spent on personal hygiene products like deodorant, shampoo, razors, or telephone calls. Or they'll buy extra things like fruit and yogurt and mineral water from the prison commissary. And actually, an investigation recently found that prison prices are actually significantly higher than the average German supermarket, even though facilities are obligated to enable prisoners to buy food at standard market rates. Now, the counter argument that I expect to probably find in the comment section is going to be that, like, well, yeah, why should we pay these guys a fair working wage? I mean, they're getting their housing for free, they're getting their food for free, and they committed a crime. It's not supposed to be a cushy life behind bars. Which is true, but here are some things just to kind of consider. While prisons don't make a profit from the inmates' work, it is important to note that many people who enter the prison system were already in debt when they got there. And so when they get out, they usually actually have even more debt thanks to all of that interest that was accruing while they were behind bars. And because prison work doesn't actually count towards a pension, there's a real risk of old age poverty if you serve out a long sentence, whether in the United States or here in Germany. In fact, a recent study by the US Bureau of Justice Statistics found that more than 50,000 people released from federal prisons in 2010, a staggering 33% of them found no employment at all over the 4 years post-release. And at any given time, no more than 40% of the cohort was employed. People who did find jobs also struggled. Formerly incarcerated people in the sample had an average of 3.4 jobs throughout the 4-year study period, suggesting that they were landing jobs that didn't offer security or opportunities for upward mobility. So here's something you might not know about the American prison system. About 1 out of every 5 people entering prison gates are young adults, and they have the worst outcomes. Racial disparities in prison rolls for this group exceeds even the outrageous disparities that already plague US incarceration rates overall. But in Germany, as you can imagine, things look a lot different for young adults. So there's actually a place that we've talked about earlier in Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania, called Neustrelitz Prison, which is considered actually a juvenile facility. But whereas in the US, the word juvenile usually refers to those under the age of 18, here at Neustrelitz Prison, the 150 men and women are almost all between the age of 19 and 25. And this difference in age demographic is largely due to the fact that here in Germany, it is hard to find a young adult in prison at all. Period. Throughout Europe, juvenile sentencing laws cover people until they're at least 18. In Germany, it's actually 21, and there's currently a political debate underway about extending the juvenile law to cover men and women up to the age of 24. And youth under the age of 14 are not considered criminally responsible. And in the vast majority of situations involving juveniles and young adults, there's a considerable effort made to avoid putting them in prison and instead imposing things like fines or doing things like public sanctions and community service. So you'll commonly see discipline that's geared towards reparations for the injury, apologies to the injured party, payment of money to charitable organizations or the state and community service. But if the crime they commit in Germany is serious enough to warrant punishment, there are huge differences in sentencing from a young adult to someone who might be entering the adult prison system. The length of the period is usually limited to between 6 months and 5 years. For serious crimes, you can find up to 10 years. And if a young adult commits a crime with the provision of a lifelong imprisonment in the general criminal law, the maximum prison sentence that they would receive as a juvenile is a 15-year term. So while under the juvenile law, young people can technically receive up to 15 years, to be honest, they rarely do. Fewer than 1% receive sentences of 5 to 10 years. Fewer than 5% receive sentences of between 3 and 5 years. Plus, Germany makes a huge effort to keep juvenile and young adult offenders away from the adult prison population. And that's largely because there's a widespread recognition that young brains are different. They're less mentally culpable for their crimes. They're usually also more open to rehabilitation and also more vulnerable to exploitation in the culture of the prison. So here's the fascinating part. In the unlikely scenario where you do have someone sentenced as a juvenile with a lengthier sentence due to the seriousness of their crime, that person will stay in the juvenile facility until they're 24 or 25 years old. And this combination of factors essentially pushes the entire German youth system upward to be more of an older, young adult system, with younger youth either diverted or handled by lighter touches administered by social services. Now, to be fair, in some US states, juveniles or young adults who commit a crime can actually stay in juvie until their mid-20s as well. But this isn't nationwide. There are a handful of states where 16 and 17-year-olds are regularly placed into adult facilities. And in all 50 states, there are transfer laws that allow or require young offenders to be prosecuted as adults for more serious offenses, regardless of how old they are. But I actually do want to go back to Neustrelitz prison because there's actually some really fascinating things happening here in terms of rehabilitation for young adults. The inmates held at this prison are typically men and women who have committed more serious crimes, more than half of them violent. So the architecture of this environment still looks a lot like American juvie. You're gonna find surveillance cameras, blue sweatsuit uniforms, steel reinforced bars over windows, and tall white walls toppled by spools of razor wire. But there are some pretty notable differences. Each room at Neustrelitz has a large window with bars, but that window opens. There's actually a law in Germany that dictates how much natural light has to come into a prisoner's room. But there are rugs and decorative lamps and flowers, and each prisoner has his or her own toilet with a door for privacy. Plus, in Germany, administrators also emphasize therapy. For example, they use bunny rabbits as part of animal therapy along with horses, sheep, and goats, and offer pretty extensive counseling and mental health services by American standards. They even have their own vineyard and learn how to make wine that they can then give as gifts to their family members or friends who come to visit them. In short, the German system's educational and rehabilitative ethics hold true when youth are incarcerated. According to Germany's youth courts law, when a youth is confined, it should, quote, arouse the youth's sense of self-respect, be structured in an educational manner, and help these youth to overcome the difficulties which contributed to his or her commission of the criminal offense in the first place. So here at Neustrelitz, you're going to find robust vocational programming, such as professional woodworking, metalworking, culinary instruction, and farming, which include award-winning rabbit husbandry, by the way. And all of these jobs pay minimum wage. And when you've served your time, the prison will actually help you to find a job and housing so that you have a more secure life post-release. And the effects of this kind of prison system are robust. Only about 30% of German juveniles and young adults come back to prison within 3 years. 70% of them don't. All right, guys, so that actually wraps up our video today on the prison system. But if you happen to miss part 1 or 2 of our series on crime, I'm going to include the links down below in the description of this video, where you can see our videos discussing differences between crime rates, as well as gun control legislation at lots of different countries around the world. So be sure to check those out if you haven't already done so. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from the Black Forest family, hit that subscribe button. So I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!